Mapping the place of Rissho Kosei-kai in the Buddhist universe. In the 21st century, Buddhism has found itself in a unique position. Today, we can encounter nearly all forms of Buddhism in close proximity to one another. A Zen center might be located just down the street from a Tibetan Buddhist Dharma center, and elsewhere in the city, one might find a Burmese or Thai Theravada Buddhist congregation, or perhaps a Chinese or Vietnamese Buddhist temple. This diversity is something to be celebrated, but it can also present challenges when it comes to understanding the place of one's own practice within the broader Buddhist tradition, or explaining it to others. Many RK members may share these questions. What is Rissho Kosei-kai's place within the broader Buddhist family? In this talk, we'll explore where Rissho Kosei-kai fits within the historical development and vast diversity of Buddhism. The aim is to provide members with a clearer map of Buddhism and Rissho Kosei-kai's position within it, enabling them to better share Rissho Kosei-kai and the Lotus Sutra tradition with others.
So I am delighted to be invited once again to deliver the Bodhi Day talk, and I consider it a great honor. I'd like to express my gratitude to Reverend Yoshizawa of Arkina and all of you who are joining us today. So my objective for this talk is to offer something beneficial to the Rissho Kosei-kai Sangha that can be useful in practice or dissemination of the Lotus Sutra. I'm fortunate to have many wonderful friends in the RK Sangha, which enables me to receive numerous questions and comments from Sangha members, and that assists me in selecting topics for talks like this. Today's talk originates from a question I received from a Sangha member several years ago. That question pertained to the appropriate location of Rissho Kosei-kai on a map that depicted various forms of Buddhism and their proximity or closeness to one another. And so when I was looking at that map, the member hadn't created the map, but they got it from someone who did. And the person had put Rissho Kosei-kai on the map in a very strange place where I thought that Kosei-kai sort of didn't belong. So I wondered about this for a long time, how to explain sort of where Kosei-kai sort of fits on a mapping of Buddhism. And excuse me, Emmy said before, 21st century Buddhism is in a very unique place because we can encounter all forms of Buddhism in close proximity to one another. And I'm sure that all of you do, especially those of you who live in a place like Los Angeles, which is kind of one of the meccas, so to speak, of Buddhism on the West Coast. And you're surrounded probably by Buddhist Dharma centers of the Tibetan lineages or Thai Theravada or Burmese Theravada, maybe some Chinese or Vietnamese Buddhist temples. And so there's a lot of diversity, and we also read a lot of books from these various lineages of Buddhism, and they're all Buddhism, but somehow they'll be a little different. So how do we make sense of all of this diversity? And I think this is something that's necessary because if you're sharing Kosei-kai with somebody, the people that you're talking to might ask you, well, where is Kosei-kai from? Where is this Lotus Sutra tradition from? What is it related to? Is it similar to the Buddhisms I know, et cetera, et cetera? Where is what is the place of Rissho Kosei-kai in the broader Buddhist family? And I have on my PowerPoint here just a shot, a Google shot of New York City, and it's kind of zoomed out, but you can see all of the Dharma centers in there in very extremely close proximity to one another. So in this talk is going to be more of a historical talk. I also try to do something a little different every year. So a historical talk looking at Kosei-kai, examining its place within the broadest Buddhist landscape. So we'll explore the connections between Rissho Kosei-kai and other Buddhist traditions worldwide. And the primary objective today is to equip members with a comprehensive understanding of Rissho Kosei-kai's position within Buddhism, and hopefully this will facilitate more effective communication and explanation of Rissho Kosei-kai and the Lotus Sutra tradition to others. So the talk today, in the talk I'll cover, basically it'll be in two main sections. So first I'll delve into the origins of the Lotus Sutra tradition that Rissho Kosei-kai inherits. So I'm certain that most of you are familiar with the basic history of Rissho Kosei-kai, that it was founded in 1938 by founder Niueno and co-founder Myoko Naganuma. But I'm guessing that a lot of you don't know sort of what happens before that, as we could say, the before time, right? So today I'd like to explore the historical context and origins of Rissho Kosei-kai's Lotus Sutra tradition and discuss how founder Niueno and co-founder Myoko inherited and developed a tradition from the past and adapted it for contemporary times. So that's the first part. And then the second part near the end, I'd like to do a comparison and see how RK compares to other forms of Lotus Sutra Buddhism. And I like to do that by looking at how a few different forms of Lotus Sutra Buddhism think about and use the Odaimoku in practice. And I think that will be a good way of understanding some of the similarities and differences and allow you to sort of locate RK within the tradition. So obviously the story of RK begins with the appearance of the Lotus Sutra, right? The development and early history of the Lotus Sutra is a subject really complicated, and scores of books have been written about it. And there are, I don't know, something like 40 or something separate theories about the development of the Lotus Sutra. There's actually recently been a book in Japanese just about all of the theories about the Lotus Sutra. So here, what I want to do today is not get too bogged down, but just give you some of the broadest strokes. So the Lotus Sutra is one of the many Mahayana sutras that began circulating in the early centuries of the Common Era, with the Lotus Sutra appearing sometime around the 2nd century. One important thing to note is that despite the fact that the Lotus Sutra is derived from India, it doesn't seem to have had a strong impact on Indian Buddhism. Now, it's quoted on occasion by some of the famous Indian Buddhist scholar monks of late Indian Buddhism, especially in some of the commentaries that the Tibetan tradition inherited from India. So we know that some of these great Indian scholar monks were aware of the Lotus Sutra. Where the Lotus Sutra seems to have had a greater impact, however, is on the fringes of the Indian world in places like Central Asia, Kashmir, Nepal. This is important because the Buddhism that was transmitted to East Asia, goes to China along the Silk Road and then is transmitted to Korea, Japan, and we often consider Vietnam to be culturally East Asian, even though it's in the South, because it's inherited or it's connected to that early ancient Chinese base of East Asian culture. So all of the Buddhism that went to those areas, including Japan, is more Central Asian in origin than Indian. And this is one of the things that makes East Asian Buddhism different from, for example, South Asian and Tibetan Buddhism. It seems that the Lotus Sutra, as well as Pure Land Buddhism, were very popular in Central Asia, and both were transmitted to East Asia along the Silk Road. To contrast, Tibetan Buddhism is very much a child of late Indian Buddhism of the 8th century and later, at a time when the practice of Tantra, for example, became very influential in Buddhism. So for this reason, some of the earlier Mahayana sutras, the sutras that were circulating and popular earlier in Buddhist history, like the Lotus Sutra, that were transmitted to China in the early centuries of the Common Era, didn't end up being as influential in Tibetan Buddhism. Jeffrey Hopkins, the great scholar of Tibetan Buddhism, once told me that in every Tibetan monastery, there's a copy of the Lotus Sutra. But he says it sits on the shelf collecting dust. That's exactly what he said to me. So this is why or one of the reasons why your friends who practice other traditions, like, for example, Tibetan Buddhism, might be unfamiliar with the Lotus Sutra, or maybe, they haven't even heard of it at all. These are some of the reasons why the Lotus Sutra isn't found in or influential. It's not influential in some of the Buddhist traditions you may have encountered in your community and across North America or Europe. The Lotus Sutra is very influential in the Buddhism of China and the countries to which China disseminated its Buddhism, including Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. The fact that the Lotus Sutra was largely disseminated in cultures within the Chinese civilizational sphere also has a great impact on the Lotus Sutra tradition. For example, the version of the Lotus Sutra that is most popular around the world today is Kumarajiva's Chinese translation. And the origins of our understanding of the Lotus Sutra largely go back to ancient Chinese scholar monks instead of Indian monks. So Kumarajiva himself was not an Indian, but a Central Asian from the ancient kingdom of Kucha, which is now in the extreme western areas of China, a place, it's kind of a crossroads between the Chinese world and the Central Asian cultural area. In China, the Lotus Sutra was first translated into Chinese in 286 CE by a monk named Dharmaraksha. And while it was a popular text, it was Kumlajiva's translation in 406 that became an instant hit, both as a religious text and as a literary masterpiece. Buddhist leaders from various sects in Chinese Buddhism or doctrinal perspectives all wrote commentaries on Kumlajiva's text. And later, perhaps around the 8th century onward in China, the Flower Garland Sutra begins to gain a greater influence in Chinese Buddhism, as well as what's called the Threefold Pure Land Sutra, which is focused on the Buddha Amitabha. However, the Lotus Sutra had a lasting impact on Chinese Buddhist faith and practice. For example, the Lotus Sutra's teaching of universal Buddhahood resonated with the notion of basic goodness, the basic goodness of humanity that was taught in the ancient Chinese philosophical tradition by, for example, the philosopher Mencius. Also, chapter 25 of the Lotus Sutra, which tells the story of the Bodhisattva regarder of the sounds of the world, became really popular, so popular that it circulated as an independent sutra in its own right. So you may find copies of what's called the Sound Regarder Sutra, or the Guanyin Jing, or Kannon Kyo in Japanese. In Chan Buddhism, which is called Zen in Japan, and Son, I believe it's called in Korea, focuses on the practice of sitting meditation. But the Lotus Sutra is nevertheless quite important. There are also many quotes and references to the Lotus Sutra in the famous Platform Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch. That's a foundational Zen text, very popular. If you practice Zen, you probably know what I'm talking about. And in the Platform Sutra tells the story of the sixth patriarch, or Huineng, who established or led the Southern Chan school to prominence. So that text is filled, and his Dharma talks are filled with quotations of the Lotus Sutra. But as I said, over time, the Flower Garland Sutra, it came to overshadow the Lotus Sutra in China, even within Chan Buddhism. In China, and also its branch in Korea, Son Buddhism. But it was in Japan that the Lotus Sutra tradition put down the deepest roots, and where it gave birth to several sects of Buddhism, several congregations of Buddhism that continue today. And it's also mainly from Japan that the Lotus Sutra has been disseminated throughout the world. And there's also, we have to consider the version of the Lotus Sutra that we have in terms of where Rissho Kosei-kai is in the Buddhist world and how its Buddhism relates to other Buddhisms. The version of the Lotus Sutra that we uphold today is a unique, somewhat different version than that found in Sanskrit or Tibetan. So this is because of the translator Kumarajiva. The Lotus Sutra was first translated into Chinese, as I said, in 286 CE by a monk named Dharmaraksha. And Dharmaraksha's version largely matches the Tibetan version of the sutra and many of, or much of, the Sanskrit copies that we have. But Kumlajiva's translation of 406 seems to have been based on a Sanskrit original that was possibly quite different, perhaps older. And the uniqueness of Kumalajiva's version had great consequences for the development of the Lotus Sutra tradition. The first and foremost of these distinctive features is that the Kumalajiva version has the 10 suchnesses, which if you're an RK practitioner, you're probably very aware of. Now, the 10 suchnesses are that Shakyamuni Buddha's explanation of the ultimate reality of all things in chapter 2. And it's part of the Kyoten that you chant every day. So for Rissho Kosei-kai, the 10 suchnesses are an important tool to diagnose the cause of suffering. And when we practice the First Noble Truth, it's used, and it also guides us in practicing the truth of the path when we develop skillful means to overcome our suffering. Now, that's something that we talked about last year in the lecture. Also, as you may know, the 10 suchnesses are the basis for the teaching of the 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought. So for this reason, the Lotus Sutra Buddhism in East Asia, including Rissho Kosei-kai, is very much a unique product of Kumalajiva's translation of the Lotus Sutra, the Sutra of the Lotus Flower, the Wondrous Dharma, if we want to translate the name of the text very exactly. So all contemporary forms of Lotus Sutra Buddhism today that are spread around the world have their origins in the teachings of Ji, often called Master Tiantai, because he practiced for a very long time on Mount Tiantai in Zhejiang province in China. He's mentioned a few times in Buddhism for Today. So if you've read Buddhism for Today, you've come across this name. Jiri himself credited his teacher, Huesa, for the Lotus Sutra teachings that he upheld, but most of our understanding of the Lotus Sutra today originates in Jiri. Jiri wrote 3 great commentaries on or related to the Lotus Sutra, in which you can find the basis of most of Chinese Tiantai Buddhism, Japanese Tendai Buddhism, Nichiren Buddhism, and also Rissho Kosei-kai's teachings. Some of the most important are Rissho Kosei-kai's understanding of the 10 suchnesses, the notion of the 10 realms within our minds, interpenetrating one another, and also the 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought. Now, other teachings of Rissho Kosei-kai that have their beginnings in Jiri and are found in, for example, Buddhism for Today include the following. Now, I'm not going to read all of these because it would take a while, but this is from the contents page of the new Buddhism for Today. And I've just very easily taken just the most obvious teachings that have their roots in Jiri's commentaries on the Lotus Sutra, Master Tiantai's commentaries, and you can see it's a lot of content. So essentially, this is like the beginning. It's like the Garden of Eden for the Lotus Sutra. The text is basically Jiri's works. Well, this is not to say, though, I would like to caution that, Rissho Kosei-kai and founder Niwano and co-founder Milko weren't creative and didn't develop and innovate. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm just saying that founder Niwano inherited a certain tradition. And then Rissho Kosei-kai has done a wonderful job of adapting that tradition to our modernity, the way we live today. And this is sort of, part of the answering the question of, so what happened? What came before 1938? What's the before time for Rissho Kosei-kai? The other Buddhist traditions, Lotus Sutra traditions that you come into contact with will also really go back to this point. So basically, this is sort of the root of the tree, I guess you could say. Now, one of the most influential teachings of Master Tiantai is what he did was when he interpreted the Lotus Sutra, he interpreted the text based on the 5 characters of the Lotus Sutra's title, Myoho Renge Kyo. He used that as a template to interpret the sutra. For Master Tiantai, the title of the sutra represented or contained the truth of the sutra itself. And the text of the Lotus Sutra was a kind of expansion, an unfolding of the truths of the five letters of Myoho Renge Kyo, um, the Odaimoka as we know it. So this is, I think you can see or anticipate, um, is really the sort of the great influence on Nichiren and Nichiren's understanding and promotion of the Daimoku, which we'll discuss a little bit later. In addition to writing the most influential commentaries on the Lotus Sutra that formed the basis of the Lotus Sutra tradition, Jiri was also known as a specialist in meditation. His practice of calming and insight meditation is very similar to the shamatha and vipassana, or calming and analytical approaches to meditation that you might have been exposed to if you studied in the various Theravada traditions or Tibetan traditions of Buddhism. However, Jiri's approach was aimed at realizing that our minds contain within them the essence of all possible realities. In other words, the teaching of the 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought. Essentially, that's the goal. Realizing that was the goal of his meditation practice. So we can think of the 3,000, we have this number 3,000, but it's really a symbolic number. We can think of it as meaning the infinity or the entirety of reality. So this is also the realization that all things are part of the realm of the Buddha, right? All things are really within the Buddha, right? Our world, just as it is the abode of the eternal original Buddha, the realm of eternally tranquil light, as it's talked about in the Threefold Lotus Sutra. So another way to realize this is, or to think about this, is that all things have Buddha nature, right? Everything, even matter itself, has Buddha nature. And this is something that Jiri's meditative methods tried to get people to realize. So founder Niwano said that his goal in founding Rissho Kosei-kai was developing its path of practice and bring to ordinary people the kind of awakenings of the Lotus Sutra that Master Tiantai had. And in Master Tiantai's time, it was really something that monastics worked at obtaining, monks who lived in temples. And they left the home life and sequestered themselves in temples and to practice, to have these realizations, to realize the world as Buddha nature, or to realize the 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought. But Founder Niwano's goal was to develop a form of practice that would allow lay people in everyday life to do this. So he comments in one of his works. The work is it was serialized in Dharma World magazine, and it was serialized, and the English translation was something like this road we have walked, aspiring to the world of the one vehicle. In Japanese, konomichi ichibutsujo no sakai o mezashite. So founder Niwano talked about the relationship between Kosei-kai and Master Tiantai's teachings. And as he begins, he says, the teaching of the 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought, which Jiri expounded in The Great Clarity and Insight, that's his text on meditation, explains that one single thought has the potential to open up the realm of the Buddhas, or conversely, manifest the realms of hell. Realizing that humans possess both of these possibilities reveals how crucial one's mindset is. This understanding leads to the realization that life is not something unchangeable. Rather, it can be transformed in any direction depending on one's attitude. This conviction and joy arise from recognizing the bright possibilities that lie ahead. Now, Founder Niwano explains, continuing, I have expressed this idea using simpler terms such as the way one thinks is how one perceives. And if you change yourself, the other person will change. Additionally, the teachings of Master Tiantai on counteracting delusions, also perceiving the ultimate reality of things and practicing insight into one's mind are woven into the practices of our association, Rissho Kosei-kai, including the practices like connecting others with the Dharma, or enhancing others' connections with the Dharma. And Founder Niwano continues, my aim has been to make these teachings resonate not through rigid forms, but through practical embodied understanding. So Founder Niwano himself is realizing or is expressing that, what his goal was. His goal was to take these sort of awakenings of Master Tiantai and sort of make them available to lay people and the broader world outside the monastery. So for the Japanese traditions, the next step is really the transmission to Japan. And here we have the important person is the monk Saicho. Saicho was not the monk who first transmitted the text of the Lotus Sutra to Japan, but the tradition of practice. As a young man, Saicho discovered the Lotus Sutra in the monastery he was practicing, and he also discovered the commentaries on it by Master Tiantai. And what Saicho did was he took the commentaries in the Lotus Sutra and he withdrew to a mountain called Mount Hiei, which is near the contemporary city of Kyoto. And he went up the mountain to meditate and to study Master Tiantai's works and to recite the Lotus Sutra and engage in ascetic practices. So Saicho was convinced of the superiority of the Lotus Sutra and the wisdom of Master Tiantai's understanding of it. And he sought to establish Master Tiantai's sect in China, Tiantai. In Japan, it came to be known as Tendai with the Japanese pronunciations. And Saicho sought to establish it centered on Mount Hiei. And there it became the Tendai sect. In 804, Saicho traveled to China to Mount Tiantai to study the Tiantai Lotus teachings directly, and then returned in Japan the next year in 805. Although the Buddhist temples and sects in Japan that already existed opposed Saicho's attempt to establish Lotus Sutra-based Buddhism in Japan, Saicho's disciples succeeded in making Mount Hiei one of the centers of Japanese Buddhism. And they spread the teachings of the Lotus Sutra in Japan, in those days, especially among the nobility and the warrior classes. Saicho sought to nurture bodhisattvas who would train on Mount Hiei for 12 years. And afterwards, they would descend the mountain and establish the teaching in Japan for the protection of Japan and Japanese society. In this way, Saicho helped to introduce the bodhisattva ethic in Japanese Buddhism and Japanese culture. Mount Hiei is called the Mother Mountain of Japanese Buddhism because the founders of all of the largest sects of Japanese Buddhism were originally ordained in and trained by the Japanese Tendai sect. For this reason, most of Japanese Buddhism, including Rinzai Zen, Soto Zen, the various Pure Land Buddhist denominations, and of course Nichiren and the Nichiren sects, are all children or descendants of Japanese Tendai Buddhism. This is especially true of Dogen, the founder of Soto Zen in Japan, and I'm assuming that some of you have come across Soto Zen in America. It's one of the more popular forms of Buddhism in the United States. Although focused on Zen meditation, Dogen quoted and discussed the Lotus Sutra more than any other sutra. If you read Dogen's monumental text, the Shobo Genzo, or the True Eye of the Dharma, the Treasure House of the True Eye of the Dharma is how we could translate it. If you read that text, and there are many English translations, you'll discover that there's just quotations of the Lotus Sutra everywhere. So I think we could even call Soto Zen the kind of Zen of the Lotus Sutra. And this is, interestingly, I think this is why President Niwano quotes Dogen so often. If you've been following Rissho Kosei-kai, President Niwano's monthly messages over the last few years, you would have spotted a number of quotes from Dogen. President Niuno is very conversant in the Shobogenzo. He knows it. He seems to know it very, very, very well. So a lot of the monthly reflections and teachings that everyone has received from President Niuno in many ways are the Lotus Sutra, sort of processed through Dogen. So with regard to RK's Rissho Kosei-kai's spiritual inheritance from Saicho, if I want to point to specific things, Saicho emphasized the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings and it's teaching that the Lotus Sutra is the way to proceed straight ahead without diverting from the path. It's called the Great Direct Way to Awakening, or the Direct Way, Jikido in Japanese. Now, Jikido, if you're a Japanese practitioner, this great way or direct path, you would have seen this in Founder Niuno's writings. It's the direct path to Buddhahood without taking any detours. This concept of the direct path is important to Founder Niuno, and he mentions it even, for example, in the vow that he inserted into the focus of devotion inside the statue, and that's enshrined in the Great Sacred Hall, which was completed in 1964. You can find copies of this, and you can see a large sort of photograph of the vow in the Niuno Museum, the Niuno Memorial Museum here at Rissho Kosei-kai headquarters. You can also see a discussion of this notion of the direct way, or going straight to Buddhahood without taking any detours. You can find it in Buddhism for Today in various places, such as page 40 is one place you can find it. And this is something that Saicho emphasized very much and used the word, this direct way or direct path, very often. And it's also something that Nichiren picked up from Saicho. Revering Buddha nature was also another aspect, and continues to be another strong aspect of the Tendai sect. In Japanese Tendai, revering Buddha nature is the foundation of the practice of marathon monks. And those are the monks who enter the mountains and forests and revere their practices to revere the Buddha nature of the natural world. This practice started as a way for monks who were sequestered on Mount Hiei for 12 years. As I said before, when you entered the Tendai sect, you had to train and be sequestered in a sort of Buddhist boot camp that was 12 years long. And so you couldn't leave the mountain. So how do you revere Buddha nature if you can't leave the mountain? Well, you can revere the Buddha nature in nature itself. And this is how the practice of the marathon monks who walk around and do pilgrimages through the mountains started. The notion is that the great life in everything that exists is Buddha nature. And so this revering of the Buddha nature of nature was part of their training and continues to be to this day. And, should I say here? You can see in this slide, there's a temple, but in front of the slide, in the little sort of circle, there's a bunch of Tendai lineage mountain practitioners. And they're in a mountain, of course. They're on a mountain called Mount Buddha Nature. This is a place that really exists. And they're chanting the sutra, and they're aimed towards or facing the summit of the mountain. So this is an example of that revering of Buddha nature, of nature itself, on Mount Buddha Nature. So you can get a sense of how important the notion of the Buddha nature of the world around us is when you have a mountain that's called Mount Buddha Nature. Okay, and the next sort of person I'd like to discuss that's in this sort of the before time of Rissho Kosei-kai is Nichiren, someone you're probably a little bit more familiar with. Nichiren was one of the bodhisattvas, those bodhisattvas trained in the Tendai sect that Saicho had set out to train. And you probably know him because his name appears in the invocation in the Kyoten. He's called the Great Bodhisattva Nichiren, revered practitioner of the Lotus Sutra. So, like Saicho before him, Nichiren saw an important role for Buddhism in society, and he believed that the Lotus Sutra was the teaching by which Buddhists as bodhisattvas could transform this world into the world of the Buddha that the threefold Lotus Sutra calls the land of eternally tranquil light. Nichiren was a great innovator because he took the teachings of the Lotus Sutra to the regular people of Japan. Until his time, the practice of Buddhism was centered on monasteries and monastic ways of practicing. And in the wider society, Buddhism was largely, although not entirely, a teaching spread among the literate elite levels of society. Nichiren was one of the first Buddhist teachers to spread the Dharma through writing letters in spoken Japanese instead of classical Chinese. Everyone before him, pretty much, who was a Buddhist, wrote in Chinese, which was a literary language, but it wasn't the language of the people. In Japan, you had a situation similar to medieval Europe, where the educated people and the clerics wrote in Latin, and the regular people spoke the local languages, which were developing into German, French, Spanish, English, Italian. The same situation or similar situation existed in Japan. But Nichiren crossed the linguistic barrier and started writing to people in spoken Japanese, which in those days was basically almost totally unheard of. Nichiren also took the teaching to the average people by introducing and really focusing on the liberation of women. In those days, many people were illiterate, and books were so expensive that even those who could read could not afford to purchase books. So in that time, books like the Threefold Lotus Sutra were hand copied. And because of the tremendous amount of labor and time required to produce copies of the Lotus Sutra, only the wealthiest people could afford a copy of the Lotus Sutra. So even many monks didn't have copies of the Lotus Sutra. And this is part of the reason why they learned to train their memories to be accurate enough as to remember the sutra by heart. Nichiren taught ways of practice that lay people of those days could do. For example, reciting the Odaimoku. Thanks to Nichiren and his followers, the Lotus Sutra became more than a faith of the elite. It became the faith of much of the Japanese population. So if you want to take a look at RK's inheritance from Nichiren, Nichiren was and remains an important inspiration for RK and an example of a Lotus Sutra Bodhisattva. And Nichiren's strong influence can be seen, especially in RK's early period. For example, this picture of the Kyoten here, this is a copy of RK's first printed version of the Kyoten. There were earlier versions that were hand copied, but this is the printed version, the first one. And what we can see here, and I've got a translation here, is a section of the Kyoten was a quote from Nichiren's treatise on the establishment of the true teaching to pacify the nation. It's a very, very important text by Nichiren that talks about how Buddhism is necessary to establish a just and healthy and safe society. In Japanese, the text is called Rissho Kokuron. And I'm not going to read the quote. You can take a look at it. I hope the letters are large enough that you can see it. But there's the influence there. And the connection really is, I think, is Nichiren's concern for society, for serving others in the wider society. And that's something that Founder Nirudo and Founder Myoko were sharing. And it's one of the reasons why Nichiren, of course, is such an important exemplar for them, important model for them. So while Nichiren remains a great inspiration and a model of the Bodhisattva possessing the courage to work for the liberation of people and the establishment of peace in the world, RK's teachings and understandings of Lotus Sutra differ in substantial ways from Nichiren Buddhism. But Nichiren's legacy can be seen today probably most prominently in the ritual practices of Rissho Kosei-kai. So these include things like the use of the sash, the otaski, and also the wooden drum, the mokusho. And most prominently, maybe the chanting of the odaimoku. So even if Nichiren, RK's teachings don't exactly follow those of Nichiren's, to people looking in from the outside, Rissho Kosei-kai looks very much like Nichiren Buddhism. So for example, the sash is also worn by Buddhist monks. Originally, the sash was a form of the Buddha's robe that monks wore when they were working, when they were doing things around the temple. And they would take the normal sort of large Buddha's robe that they would wrap around themselves and they would fold it up and they would pin it or stitch it, and then they would wrap it around their body. And that developed into the sash. Now, the sash is used in a number of Buddhist groups by a number of Buddhist groups in Japan, but it's primarily, you see it most often used by the Buddhist priests in the Nichiren sect. So there's a perception that it's kind of like a Nichiren sect thing. So when people see the use of the sash, they think, oh, Nichiren Buddhism. And also with regard to the wooden drum is mostly, and this is the upper picture here, the wooden drum is mostly used by the different groups of Nichiren Buddhism. The other Buddhist sects in Japan, they use the, okay, hold on a second. Sorry. Let me get back here. Okay. They use this, the bottom picture, which is basically the wooden fish drum. And that's called a mokugyo. So here's the, like, in Buddhism, the type of utensils that are being used and the type of sort of the version of the Buddhist robe that's used, these sort of are like markers of sort of identity, right, of sectarian identity. So when people look at RK looks like Nichiren Buddhism, looks like the Nichiren sect. And so this can be sometimes a cause of some confusion and misunderstanding about Rissho Kosei-kai. So there's a common misunderstanding that all Buddhism based on the Lotus Sutra belongs to the Nichiren sect. And then this thinking in people's minds can be reinforced by seeing, I guess you could say, the religious material culture of Rissho Kosei-kai. So a lot of people you may meet that come to the Dharma Center, they might think that Rissho Kosei-kai is some kind of lay group of the Nichiren sect of Buddhism, right? I think many of you have experienced that. So these are some of the reasons why that thinking is out there. So as many of you know, founder Niwano and co-founder Myoko were members of Ryukai, an organization of lay Buddhists based in Nichiren Buddhism that began in 1920. Some RK practices, such as bestowing posthumous names for all of the ancestors of both sides of one's family, your mom's side and your father's side, that tradition begins or is inherited from Ryukai. And this is a very unique practice, and it's unique to, for example, Ryukai, Rissho Kosei-kai, and a few other groups that also are descendant from Ryukai. So most Buddhist traditions in Japan and throughout East Asia enshrine the male lineage of a family only in their family altars. It was the customary belief that when women married, they left their family lineages and join the lineage of their husband's family. And thus their ancestors like switched. Their ancestors became the ancestors of their husband's line. In other words, they were detached from their father's family's ancestors and attached to their husband's sort of ancestral lineage. And so traditionally in East Asia, it's the duty of wives, women, to take care of the altar and the funerary tablets of their husband's family. There was no enshrinement of the maternal side. So it was the founder of Ryukai, a fellow named Kubo Kakutaro, who began the practice of enshrining the ancestors of both sides of a family, meaning the patrilineage and the matrilineage. And this is an RK practice that remains to this day. And it's very interesting because whereas sometimes in Europe or North America, people are unfamiliar with and a little, maybe sometimes uncomfortable with the notion of enshrining ancestors. Sometimes RK in other East Asian companies, East Asian countries can run across some issues where the local population, people in Taiwan or people in Korea, think it's strange that the maternal line is also enshrined. And they sort of scratch their heads at that because of this tradition, which I probably is largely coming from or is the influence of Confucianism. So it's interesting. This is a very unique practice to Kosei-kai, and it's not widespread throughout East Asian Buddhism. So although Ryukai was officially a lay organization, its members, it was very interesting, its members were composed of all types of people, including scholars of Buddhism and East Asian thought, like, for example, founder Niuno's teacher, a man named Arai Skenobu. And there were also some ordained Buddhist priests from the Tendai sect and Nichiren sects that were involved in Ryukai. After its founding, Rissho Kosei-kai was very close to the Nichiren denomination, the largest of the Nichiren-related sects of Japanese Buddhism. Now, the head temple of the Nichiren sect is Kuonji Temple, which is on Mount Minobu, and it was founded by Nichiren in the year 1274. However, over time, differences in understandings of teachings and practice, as well as the role of Buddhism in society, led to a kind of cooling of the relationship between RK and the Nichiren sect. Convinced that the calling of the practitioner of the Lotus Sutra was active engagement with the world through devotion to others in society at large, founder Niuno found the clerical Buddhism of the Nichiren sect kind of conservative, unwilling to actively and personally reach out to work for the liberation of others. And instead, he found the monastic priesthood content to engage in sort of expounding the teachings of Nichiren as an intellectual knowledge, and also concentrating mostly on performing funerals and Buddhist ceremonies. There was also indications that the sudden growth and the large size of Rissho Kosei-kai, as it gained many new members in the late 1940s and early 1950s, there's some indications that the Nichiren sect and other traditional Buddhist sects were a little uncomfortable and maybe threatened. They felt threatened by that, like it's like they were going to lose patronage or something. And also, many of the people who joined Rissho Kosei-kai were already parishioners of Nichiren sect temples. So there was a little bit of, sort of fear of this new influential lay group among some, not all, but some within the Nichiren sect priesthood. And all of these factors led to sort of a growing distance between the Nichiren sect and founder Niuno and founder Myoko, co-founder Myoko. And this actually led to Founder Niwano, like deciding to better clarify the teachings of Rissho Kosei-kai and Rissho Kosei-kai's own understanding of the Lotus Sutra, to sort of make it clear who Rissho Kosei-kai is, what are the practices, and this directly linked up to Founder Niwano beginning the composition of his commentaries on the Lotus Sutra. So this sense that Founder Niwano had that the sort of traditional Buddhism was, as he put it in one of his writings, they were sort of locked in their shell. You know, they were stuck in their shell and they weren't coming out. One of the reasons why he felt that Buddhists had to sort of come out of their shell and become active in liberating society, and that was the primary mission, was because of the situation in Japan in the years following the end of the Second World War. Um, and it's hard for us to imagine those days from the standpoint of people in Japan. Japan and much of East Asia at that time were still in ruins from the war. And Japanese people in particular suffered from poverty, sickness, a lack of hope. For example, tuberculosis, which even in those days was not really such of a serious problem in the United States, was rampant in Japan. And looking abroad from the shores of Japan, the future of the world was looking very bleak. Only a few years previously to this point in the early 1950s, Mao Zedong's communist armies conquered China, a country right next door to Japan, and war was raging on the neighboring Korean peninsula. In the early 1950s, for a while, the American and UN forces were on the defensive. It looked like Japan might even be threatened. And we also can't forget that the world, of course, had already been ushered into the nuclear age, with, of course, Japan becoming the first victims of atomic bombs. But in the early 1950s, the Soviet Union, by that time, the Soviet Union had already tested their own first atomic weapon. So both sides in the Cold War had come into possession of atomic weapons. So having been the first victims of atomic bombs, the Japanese people greatly feared the possibility of a nuclear Armageddon, especially because Japan was the boundary between the opposing nuclear armed camps. If you look in the writings, and you might even be able to spot this at a few points in Buddhism for today, there is reference to the sort of the fear of nuclear war and nuclear Armageddon. Founder Niwano and co-founder Myoko and Rissho Kosei-kai, regular Rissho Kosei-kai members, for them, it was not a time of complacency, not a time for Buddhism, for business as usual. It's clear that founder Niwano and co-founder Myoko and the members at that time felt that, you know, the late 1940s, early 1950s was the kind of evil age that Shakyamuni in the Lotus Sutra says will come after his parinirvana. And so I think what both the founder and co-founder, what was their state of mind, their consciousness at the time, was that vow that in the midst of a fearful evil age, you will vow to spread the teachings of the Lotus Sutra far and wide. And so this was something that really changed the outlook of founder Niwano and co-founder Myoko. And it's one of the reasons why that distance and that split from the Nichiren sect occurred. So Kosei-kai very much begins to chart an independent course. Rissho Kosei-kai members in many Dharma centers continued their pilgrimages to Mount Minobu, which had been a long-time practice of Rissho Kosei-kai members. In those days, members donned the white clothing of religious pilgrims, and they made journeys to the temple at the base of Mount Minobu, and then they undertook the arduous climb up the summit of the mountain to the sacred precinct of the temple's inner cloister. If you have visited the Nikkyo Niwano Memorial Museum, that is in the basement of the Horinkaku, the building next to the Great Sacred Hall at Kosei-kai headquarters. You've surely seen photos of the founder and the co-founder and the early members climbing Mount Minobu. There's a sort of large photograph of this. And they're dressed in the white sort of ceremonial pilgrim's clothing that you see in the photograph. Even today, students of Gakuden Seminary still climb up Mount Minobu, and many Dharma centers continue today to make pilgrimages to Kuonji Temple. Rissho Kosei-kai still feels a great affinity for Mount Minobu. And as you can see in the invocation in the Kyoten, Rissho Kosei-kai holds a great reverence for Nichiren as a model for Lotus Sutra practitioners who devote themselves to others and to the larger society. However, while Rissho Kosei-kai has roots in the movement of there was a movement of Nichiren, a proliferation of Nichiren Buddhist lay organizations in the early 20th century. Rissho Kosei-kai is sort of coming out of that ether, but it's not one of the sects of Nichiren Buddhism, and many of Kosei-kai's practices and teachings differ from those of the Nichiren sects, and this sets Rissho Kosei-kai apart. So now I'd like to go to sort of the second part, a comparison. And we're getting close to the end here. And then we can entertain any questions or discussions you'd like to jump into. Let's make a comparison of the sects of Lotus Sutra Buddhism based on the Odaimoku. The Buddhisms of the Lotus Sutra are diverse, and even if we can think of them as within the same family or like family members, and just like in my family and your family, each of its members is an individual. Each one is different, even though there's a family resemblance. In order to get a bit of a sense of RK's place among the diverse types of Lotus Sutra Buddhism and how RK has many things in common, but is also quite unique, let's do a comparison of Tendai Buddhism, Nichiren Buddhism, and Rissho Kosei-kai. And again, like I said before, I'll do this based on how the three traditions understand and use the Odaimoku in practice. For leaders in North America and members involved in sharing the Lotus Sutra with people around the world, an understanding of these similarities and differences might be useful, since you're likely to welcome many people to the Dharma Center who have a background in Nichiren Buddhism or have practiced with other Lotus Sutra-based groups. If you're somewhat familiar with their beliefs and practices, you and then will be able to better understand each other, and in your encounter, you'll, I think, attain greater merits. But first, I'd like to just a word of caution. I'd like to just say that the comparison I'm about to do is not meant to be an evaluation of who is right and who is wrong on doctrinal or practice issues with regard to the Daimoku. It's just a comparison. I'm not making a judgment here at all. Okay, so let's take a look at the Tendai sect. And the Tendai sect I talked about before. And it's the Tendai sect in North America is probably smaller than Rissho Kosei-kai, but it exists. Its headquarters is in upstate New York. In the Tendai sect, the recitation of the Daimoku isn't a primary practice, although it's recited occasionally. Master Tiantai he composed a lot of liturgies for his religious community. And in those, the Daimoku is recited as a way of taking refuge in the Lotus Sutra as the highest Dharma. But for the Tendai tradition, the recitation of the Sutra is more important than recitation of the Daimoku. So in the Chinese path, in Chinese Tiantai, the path of practice is traditionally said to follow the 5 stages of practice that's taught in chapter 19 of the Lotus Sutra. The 5 stages of practice after the parinirvana of the Buddha. And the second stage is reading and writing of the Lotus Sutra. So for the Chinese Tiantai and then the Japanese Tendai traditions, reciting the sutra is often done, it's done every day in sutra recitation, but also for practicing, there are different ceremonial ways to practice acknowledgement and remorse or repentance. There are repentance rites um, in the tradition. And in those traditions, you will see the recitation of the Daimoku, and I've got it outlined here. The text on the right upper right is one of the liturgies composed by Master Tiantai, and you can see that part of it, there's the Daimoku there. There is the taking of refuge in many different Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and then it sort of culminates. One of the things it culminates in is taking refuge in the Daimoku or the Lotus Sutra itself. Um, So the Japanese Tendai tradition, it understands the one vehicle Lotus Sutra to include various forms of Buddhist practice that people might not always associate with the Lotus Sutra. One of these is mantrayana, or the vehicle of mantra, sometimes called tantra in everyday parlance. In Tendai, the mantra vehicle is thought to be another vehicle of practice, and just as you have the Shravaka vehicle, the Pratyeka Buddha vehicle. Um, and the Tendai sect has sort of used that notion to integrate mantra practice into their practices. And among their mantra practices, there's a form of the Odaimoku that's recited and thought of as a mantra. It's often referred to as the White Lotus mantra or the Pundarika mantra. Pundarika in Sanskrit means white lotus. And what this mantra is, it's a Sanskrit version of the Odaimoku. Although the Japanese practitioners practice it or say it with a Japanese accent and pronunciation. The Sanskrit title of the sutra or the Odaimoku in Sanskrit is Namo Siddharma Pundarika Sutra. And the Japanese practitioners will chant Namo Siddharma Pundarika Sotaran. And so some of the temples in the Tendai lineages chant this. Not all, but you often come across it. And so it's thought of as a mantra of the Lotus Sutra, essentially. And so this is where the Odaimoku appears in the Tendai sect. It's there. It's not prioritized. It's seen as, on the one hand, the regular Odaimoku Namo Myoho Renge Kyo is seen as a way of taking refuge in the Lotus Sutra, of establishing or nurturing one's faith in it. And then this mantra version of the Odaimoku is considered to be essentially a mantra, which is mantra is sort of as, in some ways, embodying the sort of power, the practice, the merits of either the bodhisattva or the text from which it comes. And that's in some ways similar to how Nichiren saw the Odaimoku. So if we would take a look at the Tendai sect, we see the Odaimoku is there, but it's not very prominent. Let's take a look at to contrast the Nichiren sects. In the Nichiren sects and many lay organizations rooted in Nichiren Buddhism, such as Soka Gakkai, the recitation of the Daimoku is considered a primary practice, in maybe even the primary practice. For example, in the Nichiren sect headquartered on Mount Minobu, as they teach, the primary things that members should do regularly are revering Nichiren's Lotus Sutra mandala as the focus of devotion and reciting the Odaimoku. Two sort of primary practices. So upholding the Odaimoku is thought to transform one's heart and mind, a transformation that changes one's view of the world and begins to motivate one to act in the world as a bodhisattva, bettering the world and upholding ethical Buddhist life. So upholding the Odaimoku by reciting it regularly and even continually keeping it in mind is a primary way of, in the Nichiren sect, of receiving and embracing the Lotus Sutra. This doesn't mean that the sutra is not recited or never recited, or that things like the six perfections aren't practiced. For those capable, the Accessory practices, in other words, sort of additional helping practices, include reading, reciting, expounding, and copying the Lotus Sutra for the benefit of oneself and others. However, the primary practice is reciting the Odaimoku. So here we see there's a big difference here. The Odaimoku is present in Tendai, but it's not very highlighted. Here, of course, it's up front in the Nichiren sects. So why do the Nichiren sects emphasize the Odaimoku so much? To keep it short and simple, the Odaimoku is believed to congeal or to embody the Lotus Sutra, and furthermore, the 5 letters, the Myoho Renge Kyo, are thought to be a kind of concretization of the truth to which Shakyamuni awoke and fully realized and revealed in the Lotus Sutra. Furthermore, maybe somewhat like the understanding of mantra, the Odaimoku is believed to embody or possess within it the practice and merits of Shakyamuni Buddha. So by upholding the Odaimoku, a person is upholding the very practice of Shakyamuni Buddha. So the person who upholds the Odaimoku begins to attain the merits of Shakyamuni Buddha's practice, and this naturally transforms one's mind, revealing and activating their Buddha nature. The practitioner manifests this inner transformation in their behavior and their interaction with others, leading to the practice of the 6 perfections, the way in which bodhisattvas liberate themselves and others. So we can summarize by saying that for the Nichiren sects, first comes the Odaimoku, and from the Odaimoku flows other practices. And so we see it's a very, very different sort of way of thinking about the Odaimoku. It's a way of prioritizing it and putting it up front. Now, let's compare this to Rissho Kosei-kai. For Rissho Kosei-kai, the Odaimoku is very important, and of course, it's recited daily. However, you'll notice that in daily recitation practice, the Odaimoku is usually for morning and evening sutra recitation. Officially, it's limited to 10 recitations. Now, this might be puzzling to practitioners from, let's say, the Nichiren sect or Soka Gakkai. It might be just very puzzling to see that Kosei-kai doesn't sort of prioritize the recitation of the Odaimoku. Now, Founder Niwano talks about the Odaimoku and his approach to it a few times, and you can find some examples in Buddhism for Today. On page 139, he says, logically speaking, a single recitation is sufficient if we pour our hearts entirely into the words. And he continues to say that, in his opinion, reciting the Odaimoku sort of many, many, many times may be counterproductive because it might lead to being bored or distracted or just become a formalistic practice, like you're just mouthing the Odaimoku and maybe doing it for the sake of appearances. The purpose of reciting the Odaimoku, according to Founder Niwano, is to nurture the conviction of faith in and reliance on the Lotus Sutra. But he felt that there was no need to excessively recite it. And in fact, maybe it was best to refrain from too much recitation of the Odaimoku. In other words, sheer volume doesn't ensure quality, and the extended recitation of the Odaimoku might even lessen the value and impact that each recitation has on us. So for Founder Niwano and Rissho Kosei-kai, the Odaimoku is primarily a form of taking refuge in the Lotus Sutra, similar to taking refuge in the 3 treasures, that refuge that begins recitation. And again, in Buddhism for Today, on page 260, Founder Niwano says, when we place Namu before the title of the sutra and recite the phrase Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, which is known as the Odaimoku, we don't worship a thing or a person or a spirit or a god outside ourselves. We take absolute refuge in the Dharma that the sutra reveals to us, the truth that animates all things. That's what we do. We recite the Odaimoku. So the Daimoku is more of a, in Rissho Kosei-kai, is more of a form of taking refuge in the sutra and the truth that the sutra reveals. But for founder Niuno, essentially, in order to take refuge in the truth of the Lotus Sutra, to take refuge in the Lotus Sutra itself, it's necessary to learn it and to put it into practice. And we can't fully take refuge in something we don't fully know. For this reason, we must understand the Lotus Sutra teachings for ourselves and put them into practice. Doing so truly allows us to take refuge in the sutra by chanting Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, because we have a sense of what we're taking refuge in. And for people who have been practicing for a while, there's a sense of liberation that is brought by the sutra in daily life. And this is some more basically passages that in which Founder Niuno talks about the Daimoku. Basically, his position is that it's more important to recite the sutra, because understanding the sutra, having faith in it, and practicing its teachings in our everyday lives is how we gradually attain a state of mind in which distress and suffering no longer hinder us. So, like he says, reciting the Daimoku is important. It's an expression of pure faith. However, what is more important is the content of the Lotus Sutra, learning it and putting it into practice. So this is why Rissho Kosei-kai puts a great emphasis on learning the sutra for oneself and putting it into practice. And that begins in recitation of the sutra itself. So for Kosei-kai, recitation of the Lotus Sutra itself is a main practice, a primary practice. And recitation of the Daimoku is more of something like an accessory practice. So it's kind of the reverse of the Nichiren sects. And interestingly, it seems to have been this way in Rissho Kosei-kai from the very beginning. So you can see this again if we go back to the first Kyoten, the first Rissho Kosei-kai Kyoten, the first printed version. At the end of the Kyoten here, we have in parentheses, it says, recite the Daimoku 10 times. So this recitation of 10, the idea that 10 is a good number, is a good amount of recitation. It's very, very early in Rissho Kosei-kai, this thinking is established. So in the daily recitations, the Daimoku is recited 10 times, but most of the recitation, of course, as you all know, is actually reciting the sutra itself. And then to understand what you're reciting, that's the motivation for Founder Niuno's commentaries on the Lotus Sutra, to provide a way for people to learn the sutra content for themselves. And this is the reason why, for example, Kosei-kai is so devoted to translating the Lotus Sutra into so many languages. And it's why Rissho Kosei-kai members recite the Lotus Sutra in their own languages, their local languages. Some of the practitioners of other types of Lotus Sutra Buddhism, they will recite the passages of the Lotus Sutra in the Sino-Japanese, even though they may not understand what it says. Kosei-kai has a very different approach, that people need to understand the sutra in order to practice it for themselves. So these are some of the differences. And I think if you understand the differences, when someone from another tradition, someone might be coming from another Lotus Sutra tradition, see Rissho Kosei-kai, oh, that's Lotus Sutra Buddhism, and walk in and expect that what they're going to find is it's going to be the same as their tradition. Because, oh, it's the Lotus Sutra, everything's, it's all the Lotus Sutra Buddhism, right? And then people might be confused as to what's going on. And then as RK members, you might be confused as to why they're confused. And so because when people don't know the words and the understandings they're using, they can end up talking past each other. But I think even though these differences exist, all the different traditions are in harmony in the conviction that receiving and embracing the Lotus Sutra whether it be by primarily chanting the sutra itself or focusing or front-loading the Odaimoku. Doing that transforms one's heart and mind, and that the true practice of the Lotus Sutra, lays in following the Bodhisattva way, as the Kyoten says, to bring peace to our families, communities, countries, and to the world. So I hope this talk has been somewhat useful to help you to contextualize Rissho Kosei-kai and find its place on the Buddhist map of the world, to know a little bit about the before time of Rissho Kosei-kai. Kosei-kai is a Buddhism for today, but is also part of a long and profound Buddhist tradition that it shares with other groups of East Asian Buddhism. In a sense, Rissho Kosei-kai was founded in 1938, but perhaps we can say that Rissho Kosei-kai's, let's say, we'll call it the manifest dimension. That's the manifest dimension of Rissho Kosei-kai from 1938. Rissho Kosei-kai becomes manifest in the world as a particular group. However, the ultimate dimension of Rissho Kosei-kai goes way back. So from the Great Sacred Hall to Mount Hiei, to Mount Tiantai, to Divine Eagle Peak in India, ultimately to the inception of the universe. So if you've stayed in the pilgrimage hall at RK in Tokyo, you can see a painting that represents this heritage very clearly. And you can see it right here on the slide. On the right-hand side of this huge mural is Divine Eagle Peak in India. In the middle is Mount Tiantai, where Master Tiantai practiced and wrote his commentaries and laid the foundations of Lotus Sutra Buddhism. And then it's hard to see, but on the left-hand side of the painting, the mural, there's Mount Hiei, Saicho's place of practice, which leads to Nichiren and the spreading of the Lotus Sutra throughout Japanese society. So it's interesting to think of where we could place Rissho Kosei-kai's Great Sacred Hall if we were going to insert it into the mural. I don't know. I was thinking maybe add a fourth part of the mural so 1, 2, 3, 4. Divine Eagle Peak, Tiantai, Hiei, Great Sacred Hall, or perhaps we could put the entire painting with all of its 3 mountains within the Great Sacred Hall. So it's interesting to think about this sort of graphically, but essentially this is part of that tradition, the before time essentially of Rissho Kosei-kai. And it's what unites all of the different groups of Lotus Sutra Buddhism, even though, as we've seen by looking at the Odaimoku, there are many unique differences. So thanks for listening, and I hope we have some time for questions and discussion.